Last one. Okay. Good afternoon, one and all. Good afternoon, one and all. This is Dr. Narsingh Rao. I am a homeopathic doctor. I did my MD in General Medicine of Homeopathy. The topic which I am going to discuss today is the roots of homeopathy in Vedas. Why should we go back and read things in the Vedas? This poem by Galat, it inspired me to go back to the fundamentals of my system of medicine in the Vedas. The truth we mortals need, us blessed to make and keep, the all-wise slightly covered over, but did not bury deep. The poem reads out as that the true knowledge what every human being needs to make his life, to propagate his life, to lead a comfortable life. Everything is already given by the God, the Almighty. Okay? He did not bury it somewhere deep. It is slightly covered over. And what is that? What is that is covering us? Our own prejudice, our own ignorance, our own Maya, all this is covering. So we have to uncover all these things and go back and search for it, and we will get the true knowledge. And this true knowledge will help us to lead a better life. So day in and day out, for reasons known and unknown, while leading our regular life, we tend to fall sick. And usually what we do, we approach doctors and take treatment. Okay. Like allopathy, the most prominent system of medicine nowadays, and then there are well recognized complementary and alternative systems of medicine also, like homeopathy and Ayurveda. It is very interesting to see that these alternative systems of medicine, their construction is based on the inductive logic. There are actually two logics, inductive logic and deductive logic, and their construction is based on inductive logic. So inductive logic, its root is there in Vedas. Okay? In Vedas, the general method is from particular truths you reach a general truth, And all these complementary systems of medicine like homeopathy, Ayurveda, they all are constructed on the foundation of inductive logic. We'll be reading the study. Our effort will be to expedite the fundamental principles of homeopathic system and then to search for the reference of the fundamental principles of homeopathic system in the Vedic literature, and then in the summary and conclusion we will establish the existence of roots of this system of medicine in the Vedas. Yeah. First of all, most of you are from non-medical background. Some of you might not even heard the word homeopathy. So let us see what is homeopathy. Homeopathy, it's a medical science developed by Dr. Samuel Hahnemann. He is a German physician, and this system of medicine is based on principle law of similars. That is, like cures like. In simple words, it means that any substance which can produce symptoms in a healthy person can cure similar symptoms in a person who is sick. And not only Hahnemann, even prior to him also many a genius like Aristotle, Hippocrates, and even in the Hindu manuscript, that is the Vedas, this law was existing. But then Dr. Hahnemann, he made it a science of healing. Then what are Vedas? Vedas is not just a very people have a very narrow lookout about it, think that it is only related to some particular religion or anything like that. It is not like that. Vedas are from the root word with, means to know. So it is a subject which embodies all the knowledge of all the sciences. Okay, whether it is homeopathy, whether it's a technology, whether it's a computer science, whether it is aeronautical, anything. And Vedas deal with knowledge, not just para, even apara. Okay, both mundane as well as the transcendental. Yeah, let us take a look into the cardinal principles of homeopathy. The cardinal principles of homeopathy are: number 1, law of similar; number 2, law of single; number 3, law of minimum; then theory of vital principle, theory of chronic diseases, namely psoriasis, psychosis and syphilis; then there is a doctrine of drug dynamization, and then doctrine of drug proving. And each of these cardinal principles, we will see whether there is any reference to these principles in the Vedic literature or not. What do Vedas speak about the cardinal principles of homeopathy? First law, the law of similars. The earliest reference of the natural law of similia is found in Srimad Bhagavatam. Let us read it. Does not the drug that deranges the health of human being remove the same disease when used as a medicine? So it is, this law of similars was there in the Vedic period. Already it is there in the Srimad Bhagavatam. Okay, but then Dr. Hahnemann, he made it a science of healing. So the law is already existing, application was missing, but then it was fulfilled by the other doctors. Right. In the period of Mahabharata also, Sri Bhima, when he was poisoned, he recovered from the poisonous effects of that poison by a snake bite. So it is like cures the like. That is what the principle speaks about. Law of single. We know that our view at a living being, a human being, is not just the parts. We are not, nowhere in the Veda will you see this reductionistic approach of specialization, or like cutting the things apart and see. That's what I said. Now it is based on inductive logic, means from particular observations you come to a general observation. So life in every single cell, metabolism in every single cell is combined, understood as a whole entity. So Vedas also consider human being as a single entity, not mere an assemble of organs and tissue. That's what one of the earlier speakers in the morning session was saying. Law of minimum means homeopathy advocates minimum usage of medicine, just as to effect the cure. Not something, not the massive things, anything. Okay, how much is required? Only that much. And that the same principle you see in so many traditional practices, like the Achamana. No doubt it is a religious practice, but there is a lot of science behind it. See, in the Achamana, what they do is, by reciting 3 Govinda Namas, they will take 3 sips of water. And the 3 sips of water, they will take only that much water which can immerse the small black gram seed. Okay, and usually not only as a part of the puja or anything like that, this practice is there whenever they go to any yatra, whenever they go to a new village, whenever they go to a new person's house, because in those days waterborne diseases were many. Okay, so what they used to do is take these 3 sips of water, minimum quantity of water, and remain like that for some time. And they believed that after taking this sample of water, their body will get tuned to that and it will be able to accommodate the rest of the water in that new place. So law of minimum was existing. Theory of vital principle. Yes, Atharva Veda and its sub-Veda Ayurveda, it speaks about 5 sheets of human existence. Every human individual is composed of 5 levels of existence, 5 sheets. They are Annamaya Kosha, Pranamaya Kosha, Manomaya Kosha, Vijnanamaya Kosha and Anandamaya Kosha. This Annamaya Kosha deals with the gross parts of the human being, your eye, nose, hair and everything. Okay, this biochemical structure is nothing but Annamaya Kosha. It is fed by the Anna, so that is why it is called as Annamaya Kosha, and it is made of 5 natural elements. And then there is an energy subtle body inside this that is called as Pranamaya Kosha. Okay, the same cell remains once a person is dead, but then something is missing in that. Okay, that is nothing but this energy, the flowing energy, that is nothing but Pranamaya Kosha. And then there is Manomaya Kosha. Manomaya Kosha is nothing but the will, intellect and memory of the person. And then Vijnanamaya Kosha, the intelligence aspect of it. Anandamaya Kosha is the bliss body of it. So every human being exists in the form of 5 sheets. Within one human being, these 5 beings are there. So that is what Ayurveda, the sub-Veda of the Atharvana Veda says. Even Brahma Sutra 2 and 148 also, it says, it speaks about prana. That is nothing but the Pranamaya Kosha of the Panchakosha Tattva. Yeah. And the next principle is theory of chronic diseases, Sora, psychosis and syphilis. See, in homeopathy, all the diseases which can attack a human being, they are classified into 3 categories. Okay, they are called as chronic miasms or chronic diseases or Sora, psychosis and syphilis. Actually, as I was preparing for this seminar, then I understood that it is not totally similar to that of the 3 gunas which are existing in the Vedas, but there is a little simile in that. Okay, maybe the founder of homeopathy, Dr. Hahnemann, after going through these 3 gunas, he might have discovered these 3 varieties of diseases. In Srimad Bhagavatam, we find the following statement: all states of matter being whether seen, heard or conceived by the intelligence are constituted by the gunas. The 3 gunas never occur individually, they are always combined. In reality, in this world there is no pure tamas or pure rajas or pure sattva. Same thing, even the chronic diseases of homeopathy, the theory of chronic disease says that these Sora, syphilis, psychosis, they cannot exist independently. They are always in various combinations like Sora, syphilis, psychosyphilis and Sora, syphilis, psychosis. Then there is a doctrine of drug dynamation in homeopathy, where like the drugs are ultra diluted to an subphysiological and infinitesimal level, so that their therapeutic activity increases and there won't be any side effects. And the same thing is recited in Ayurveda, which says that Mardhanam Gunavardhanam, means you rub the medicine so much that it will not cause any bad effects. The more you rub it, the more its potency will come out of the latency. Yeah. Drawing a simile between the Vedantic concept of cure and that of homeopathy. Sushrutanam Charaka Samhita gives definition of right medicine, gives definition of a true physician, and it also defines what is highest ideal of cure, what is the ideal method to cure an individual. That alone is the right medicine which can remove disease. He alone is the true physician who can restore health. That method of treatment which treats an existing disease syndrome but gives rise to another new set of symptoms is not the method for ideal cure, whereas that method which a symptom complex without exciting any other in its stead is the ideal cure. So you take a medicine, it should relieve you of your symptoms and suffering. If it is adding any other symptoms, new symptoms because of the property of the medicine or anything like that, then that is not ideal cure as per the definition given here. It is very interesting to see that the principles of homeopathy also, they are laid out in one book called as Organon of Medicine, and even that is also like the shlokas only it is written in the form of number of aphorisms. There are total 294 aphorisms. In that the first aphorism and the second aphorism define the same way what is ideal cure and what is a physician. The physician's high and only mission is to restore the sick to health. Okay, what was mentioned in Sushruta Samhita. Aphorism 2 reads as, the highest ideal of cure is rapid, gentle and permanent restoration of health, not mere removal of the symptoms. Suppose my fever comes down immediately, but then I don't feel well-being, my energy level is low, then it is not restoration to health. That is just removal of the sickness. Yeah, and then I discussed about 5 koshas, right? Annamaya, Pranamaya, Manomaya, Vijnanamaya and Anandamaya kosha. And you know the modern drugs what you use, they go and act on the biochemical plane, that is the Annamaya kosha. And then homeopathy, it is using infinitesimal doses, and it is found to influence the Manomaya kosha, the will, intellect and memory, as well as the energy body, that is Pranamaya kosha. And it is very important to see that the Manomaya kosha, it stands in between the 5 koshas. Okay, it controls the Pranamaya kosha and the Annamaya kosha, and it is in turn governed by the Vijnanamaya kosha and the Anandamaya kosha. So it is like the center to the human existence. This research was done in Bark Institute. Yeah. Srimad Bhagavatam describes, O good soul, does not a thing applied therapeutically cure a disease which was caused by that the very same thing. Okay, the common example for everybody to understand is mostly milk sometimes causes dyspepsia, that is bloating of the abdomen, it causes indigestion. And when the same milk, when it is converted into curd, you churn it, make it buttermilk and you give it, the symptoms come down. Yes, to summarize whatever the literature, whatever the cardinal principles of homeopathy were mentioned in the scriptures, homeopathy is a system of medicine which works on the principle of let the like be treated with likes, using a single medicine. It doesn't incorporate many medicines. And simple medicine, because it uses single medicine, because Veda says we are a single entity. And then simple medicine, use only minimum dose. At a given instance of the suffering of an individual who is viewed holistically, not into parts, considering his physical, the Annamaya kosha, mental, the Manomaya kosha, and any other spheres where the physician can intervene, the Pranamaya kosha also. Henceforth, the roots of homeopathic system of medicine and its principles of practice exist in the Vedas. These are my references, and then thanks and best wishes for your holistic health. Thank you. Yeah, see, that was the reason, I took up this topic. Actually, homeopathy was there in India along with Ayurveda. Actually, it is, Ayurveda speaks about 2 principles, contraria principle and law of simile. Means, treating a given case of patient by giving an opposite medicine. Like if he has a pain, you give a painkiller. Okay, and in certain condition it advocates if the person has pain, you give him something which increases the pain. And this second principle was found to be curative, means it gives a lasting relief. The first one was called Viparita Chikitsa, the second one was called Tadardhakari Chikitsa. But then due to human loving for a quick fix, when they become sick they want a easy fix to that. So Viparita Chikitsa got popular, and then that Hippocrates and all, they developed it into allopathic medicine, antipathic medicine, various medicines came out of it. But then this was lying submerged for many period of time. Then the founder of homeopathy, He was a vast reader. He was a voracious reader. He had knowledge about 16 languages in in 17th century. So he had gone through some of our. There is no evidence that he has gone through this, but then he was widely read, and we can see that there is a resemblance to the symptoms. I mean the principles. So this is he took up this Tadardhakari Chikitsa. He was an allopathy doctor himself. Okay, he took up this Tadardhakari Chikitsa. He did lot of experimentation on himself, and after that he took 12 years and he constructed this system of medicine. For now, all over the world, India is leading in the homeopathic services. Oh, okay, okay.
Concepts of Annamaya Kosha, Pranamaya Kosha, Manomaya Kosha, and Anandamaya Kosha. From where we have taken this concept?
This is there in the Vedas. It is there in the Ayurveda itself. Ayurveda, when it describes about life, okay, it says that life is not just a body which is moving. It says that body with movement, with health, with energy, with righteous thinking, righteous this thing. Not just living doesn't mean your heart is working and your pulse is working, that is not just life. You know, Ayurveda described health in all these spheres. So it is there in Ayurveda.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, because of limitation of time, we cannot go with other questions. So next I will invite...
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll be speaking about this mathematical genius called Ramanujan. Normally, people discuss, his mathematics, his theories, his equations. But today, I am not going to be speaking about that. I am going to be trying to tell you how he got those equations. How he got that, the epiphany or that knowledge that suddenly came to him. So there are a lot of things behind it. So it is an active area of research. People are still not sure what's going on. So let's see how his life progressed and what he did. I'll start with the most famous quote of Srinivasa Ramanujan. So it goes something like this. An equation has no meaning for me unless it expresses a thought of God. This is a statement which he made to his colleague G.H. Hardy. So G.H. Hardy was a person who sponsored him, as you might know, and I will explain further. This is a profound statement coming from a pure mathematician, because unless how do you express God? For him it was equations, mathematics. So this thought came after a long process of training, and he went all the way to England, and then this statement came out. But his beginnings were very humble. So this was his childhood home in Kumbakonam in Tamil Nadu. So he was from a very poor family, okay, and he had many younger brothers who passed away at a very early age because of many diseases and different issues. So he was the only one who survived to be more than 30 years old. So at his younger age, his mother was the person who initiated him into the religious system, that is Hinduism in this case. So what he learned was the stories from the Puranas and some religious songs and bhajans from his mother, and he used to practice it. And people say that he was actively involved in temple activities, and he also had a shaved head and a shikha like a Brahmin. So he was a very religious person from a very young age, and then something he learned. So some of the quotes are actually not from him directly. Most of the quotes come from his colleagues, his friends. So this is a extract from a professor from San Jose State University, so who has written a small biography about Ramanujan. So to his schoolmates, he was someone who could entertain them with recitations of religious philosophy, but could also tell them about scientific matters such as astronomy. So you can see that he was also not only scientific in thinking, he also had a religious side to him. So how can these two coexist in a person is what we'll try to find out. So this is a very interesting anecdote. One of the friends says that at one point Ramanujam was sharing his room with two brothers, and one of the brothers was talking about astronomy. The other brother was sleeping and he was quite disturbed. So he poured cold water on Ramanujam's heating brain, so to cool it off. And Ramanujan, instead of turning violent, he just said that he just bathed in the Ganges river. Of course, for the Hindus, Ganges river is supposed to be the most sacred river. So this sort of gives an idea of how he was, how he could interpret everything in a very spiritual sense rather than just a straightforward way. Okay. So what happened was he was very poor, and since his math skills were excellent, he got a lot of recommendation from his school teachers to get into college. But what happened in college was he had courses which didn't involve math, and he fared quite poorly. So especially psychology and physiology, these were the two subjects he really was struggling. So what happened was, as the author claims, he said that the course in physiology involved dissection of frogs. So Ramanujan, being a vegetarian as well as a person who opposes meat and such things, he couldn't dissect the frogs or the animals. So he failed those examinations and he was kicked out of college, and eventually he didn't know what to do. So this happened in the government college Kumbakonam. Then he got another chance where he was given a chance to register in a college in Madras, Pachayappa College. There the same thing happened. He couldn't pass his other subjects except mathematics, where he scored almost full all the time. So now his religious beliefs influenced him so much that he couldn't even cope with the other subjects, which were sort of against what he believed in. So okay, so since he was kicked out of college twice, and he was asked, his friend asked him, how do you manage, where do you get money from? So Ramanujam was very clear. He said, the gods give me money. And something like, in Isha Upanishad, it is told that, God feeds all the living beings. So he also believes that. How vague is it? So, of course, he was also a genius to talk to, and he was openly a devout devotee of Narasimha, Hindu god. So this devotion came to him according to sources from his mother, the mother actually was a devotee of the god Narasimha, especially in a temple in southern India in a place called Namakkal. So there is a temple of Narasimha with his consort Mahalakshmi. So that devotion came to him from his mother, and he continued to remain devoted to that god. So this is the temple of Narasimha in Namakkal. You can see that there is this big rock kind of structure on which there is a fort, and just below the rock structure is the temple dedicated to Narasimha. And the goddess Mahalakshmi, to whom he was completely devoted, this is the picture. In fact, it so happened that this devotion wouldn't let him go abroad. So what happened was, after he dropped out from Pachayappa College, he got another chance and he started reading mathematical paper, and he sent some of his papers abroad. Many of the English mathematicians were not very impressed, but a person called G.H. Hardy, from London, he was very interested in Ramanujan. So he wrote to him asking him to come to England to do further research. But his mother, Ramanujan's mother, and Ramanujan decided that they wouldn't go to England because somehow the god Narasimha and the goddess Mahalakshmi wouldn't let him go there. Somehow they had a divine feeling that something would go wrong if he goes abroad. So further convincing was needed. So what G.H. Hardy did was he gave those papers to his colleague Littlewood and asked him for his expert opinion. And then Hardy found that without Ramanujan it was not possible for having new research in mathematics. So what happened was he contacted a professor called E.H. Neville, who was from England but at that time lecturing in Madras or Chennai of today. And he asked Neville to go to Kumbakonam, catch Ramanujan and actually bring him to England. So after a lot of convincing, somehow Neville maybe was not able to convince, but some divine intervention happened, due to which Ramanujan's mother got a dream where the goddess Mahalakshmi said that don't stand in the way of Ramanujan and achieving his dreams. And so Neville was somehow successful in getting Ramanujan to England. So once he reached there, he actually used to wear the dhoti and the Indian dress, but in England it was quite cold, so somehow reluctantly he changed to the English style of dressing, but he wouldn't change his style of food. Even when the vegetarian food was not available, he still wouldn't consume non-veg. And during the World War, the vegetarian food was in fact scarce. So he actually went to England at about 1915-17. So at that point of time, the First World War was going on. So Europe was in turmoil, and still he wouldn't change his beliefs and systems. So people say that this vegetarianism actually caused his death, but how far is it true? No one knows. Actually, the thing is, before going to England itself, at his younger age, he was quite a sick child, and he had many younger brothers who passed away. So was it his vegetarianism and lack of nourishment which caused his death, or was it something else? The debate is still on. People are still researching what would have gone wrong, and people have taken his medical records and whatever was available till 90s, even till today it's going on, the research. In 94 there was a significant breakthrough regarding this. One of the researchers from US who saw his medical diagnostics actually said was that he was diagnosed with tuberculosis, which was wrong in England, and he was given medication for tuberculosis, whereas what had happened was he had actually contracted a disease which was actually for the liver, disease of the liver, which actually was a tropical disease unknown in England, but that he had contracted while he was in Tamil Nadu. So people in England actually gave him the wrong medication, and that could have caused his death, is what that research said, but still the books are open and things are inconclusive. So if this is figured out, then people can actually get into how Ramanujan thought, because all of his habits, including food habits, somehow influenced the way he thought. So I'll move on. So Seshu Iyer was his friend, and Ramachandra Rao was one of his collaborators. Actually, during one of the times when he failed, he couldn't show his face at home, so he ran away to a place called Rajamandri in Andhra Pradesh. So this Ramachandra Rao was kind enough to host him there. So actually this is a statement made by G.H. Hardy. So what he says was, Sheshu Iyer and Ramachandra Rao say that Ramanujam had a definite religious views. He had a special veneration for the Namakal goddess. He believed in existence of a supreme being and in attainment of godhead by men. He had settled convictions about problem of life after life. While I say his religion was a matter of observance and not of intellectual conviction, and I remember well his telling me, much to my surprise, that all religions seem to him more or less equally true. So why I am giving this statement is because to him this religious thing is not just conditioned based on something indoctrined by something. It can be very spiritual. So for him Namakal goddess was the supreme being. So for anyone else it could be anything else. So that's what he said. So this is what G.H. Hardy believed, that he said that all religions seem to be true. But what Ramanujan actually believed is not quite known, except that he believed in God through equations. So I would like to end this talk by this statement. So this was given much after Ramanujan's death. In 100 years of mathematics, there was a publication. So the great advances in mathematics have not been made by logic, but by creative imagination. The title of mathematician can scarcely be denied to Ramanujan, who hardly gave any proofs of many theorems which he enumerated. So what I want to say from this talk, this statement is that advances in mathematics have not been made by logic, but by creative imagination. Where does this imagination come from? To him it was, the Namakal goddess. But how do you, put it into perspective? What research can be done to find that? How these ideas come into a mind? This is a very interesting topic which, hardly has been studied. So if what Ramanujan did could be actually, proved, or, how his, lifestyle choices affect this, if it can be found out, that would be a great insight into this world of mind. So this is him, and India commemorated his birth anniversary with a postage stamp in 1954, I think. Yes. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. So the topic of my talk is dogmatic science versus pragmatic spirituality. So I chose this title because typically the view is the opposite. I mean, normally people believe that science is very pragmatic, practical, and the religions or the spirituality, they are very dogmatic. Okay, so let's see to what extent these statements are true. Okay, so this is just to motivate. So as if all the religious leaders say no question, God did it and God wills it, so therefore it is ultimate. And in science, the scientists are always open to ask, okay, do you have any question? So this is the typical view. Okay, let us see. So the common perception of spiritual or religious dogma, of course, I mean, if you go into detail, spirituality and religion, they have different meaning, right? So spirituality is a concept, philosophical, while religion include a lot of rituals, a lot of practical activities in order to live those principles of spiritualities. But here I am not making those distinction. For the purpose of this talk, we can take them to be synonymous. Okay, so one aspect of the typical religious dogma is the unquestionable scripture, that okay, the scriptures are the holy book and you cannot question them or doubt them. The next dogma is a strict adherence to ritual. That's common in any religion. You cannot, deviate from the specified rituals if you are practicing. And then, of course, blind faith. Okay. Now, let us see that is science really free from these attributes. Okay. So, I say that there are some scriptural dogma of science. So, I will go through all these three things: scriptures, rituals, and faith. So, the scriptural dogma of science constitute firstly of textbook. So, how many of you, when you were introduced to, say, for example, the atomic theory in school, probably in class 8 or 9, questioned the textbook or the teacher and said that I want to go to the lab, see the atom in my own eyes, and then I want to believe? Probably none of you did. You accepted. So, is it not putting, unquestionable faith on the scripture of it? That is your textbook. Second, research papers in journals, conference, and proceedings. Once they are published, often we go into different forums and cite them. Many times we do not read the whole paper. We just cherry pick some, a topic that suits us, and then we say, okay, it has been said in that paper, it has been written by such a famous author, so it must be true. So here again is a piece of dogma. The next aspect, ritualistic dogma of science. So we believe, okay, science is universal, it is free from rituals and all that. So let us see. So, if you go to experimental science, you will see, perhaps you have already experienced that many institutions, they have different apparatus set up, right? And different way of performing the experiments. And also they insist on different way of tabulation of experimental observation. Like I remember when I was studying higher secondary in St. Xavier's College, so in our chemistry lab every week we had to go and prepare a chart of what experiment we are going to do in a specific method. And before we do the experiment, the lab instructor would check our notebook, and if it is not in the proper format, in the format that he wanted, then we would not be allowed to attend the lab. So, and these rituals actually depend from institution, they vary from institute to institute, as the rituals of religions also vary. Okay, so on the same spiritual principle, if there are different rituals in different religions, that is analogous to, on the same subject, same topic, maybe the same textbook, still different rituals of delivering both theoretical and practical knowledge in different institutes, different schools. We often say, okay, this school of thought says this school of thought says this. So those things are there. The next thing is dogma of faith in science. So, of course, you have infringing faith in your teachers. If you ask something, if the teacher answers, okay, that is final for most of us. Of course, there are some exceptional students. I'm not taking into account of them in general. Faith in renowned scientists. Okay, if Stephen Hawking says that, the universe, began this way, then the universe has no choice than to begin in that way. So that's our view. Okay. And interestingly, I wanted to raise the example of Stephen Hawking because he said that there is a Big Bang, and before Big Bang there was, nothing existing. So the universe came into being at a certain point of time. Whereas our Vedic view says that the universe is evolve in a cycle, right? So there is Big Bang and Big Crunch. And this early this year, there was a paper in Physical Review B by two physicists that actually talks about this Vedantic model, and it says that in the Big Bang, actually if you go back in zero time, there is no singularity and the system oscillates. So it goes close to the singularity, but then again it comes out, then again it goes to the singularity, and so on. So it's a cyclical nature, almost beginning and then almost end, but it never completely begins and it never completely ends. So it's actually ever existing. So anyway, so again we have faith in the teacher, faith in the scientists who, based on whose theory the textbooks are written, and also we have faith in the textbook, we have faith in the journal editors who are selecting the papers. Many times you will see, if you are doing research, that one paper is published in a journal or a conference, and then few years down the line some other authors are writing another paper refuting the old results, right? So what is the basis of your faith? Okay, you do not know if something is published that is ever going to be true. So this dogma of faith is in science also in a way that is also blind faith. Okay. Now once we have looked at the dogma aspect between spirituality and science, let's look at the practicality or the pragmatism in both. So the common perception of pragmatism in science is that science tries to solve practical problems. So it is not something hypothetical or abstract or philosophical. It solves real world problems. So the science builds the theory to solve the real world problem, and the technology and engineering takes up that theory and implements it. So the science and technology goes hand in hand. For example, the bus helps you to go from one place to other place much faster. Okay. The second aspect of pragmatism in science is that it is based on logic and reasoning. So it derives step by step its laws, okay, and the left hand side equals the right hand side. And the third aspect of science is that it is verifiable. So if someone claims that okay, a particular angle of a triangle is 60 degree, you can take an instrument and measure it. Okay. So these are the three attributes of science. Now let us look at spirituality or religion, whether it doesn't have these properties or it indeed has these properties. Okay. Now I claim that actually whatever are the lines here, I have highlighted science and science in red. You can take each line as it is and replace the word science by religion or spirituality. That's what I will do. So spirituality also, I say, solve practical problem and makes our life more comfortable. Why? Because science actually tries to fix the outside world. So there are problems in the outside world, right? That okay, how to travel faster, how to make your life more comfortable, how to dress up nicely, and so on and so forth. And spirituality tries to fix the inside world. Okay. So if your inside world is not going in the right direction, then even if you make the outside world perfect, you will not be happy, right? On the other hand, if your inside world is happy, even if the outside world goes wrong, still you have a chance to become happy. So the inside world is more important than the outside world. So spirituality takes up the difficult problem to solve, and there are many problems in our inside world. So for example, there are like 6 ripus we talk about, right, in our Vedic philosophy, like greed, then envy, etc. The thing is that our well-being is a balance of the inside world and the outside world, so actually both are needed. So a combination of science and spirituality. Okay. So the next, logical pragmatism in spirituality. So spirituality is also based on logic and reasoning. So just like in science you have a good teacher and a bad teacher. So if you have a good science teacher, that teacher will encourage questions from you, try to make you understand. If you have some doubt, probably the teacher will repeat the same thing 3 times and 4 times, would not mind. If the teacher is a bad teacher, then the teacher will say, okay, you are too young, you should not ask this question, you will know later, I have no time, and so thing. And same thing in spirituality also. So if you are, if you are able to access a bona fide spiritual teacher, then of course that teacher will not ask you to accept anything on blind faith. Rather, that person will encourage your questions, your inquisitiveness. And the same thing is depicted in our Vedic literature. You see Bhagavad Gita, that's a question and answer between Arjuna and Krishna. And after describing the entire Bhagavad Gita in the 18th chapter, the Krishna says that I have told you everything, now I have told you everything, now you decide what you have to do. Krishna doesn't tell Arjuna, now you have to fight, you have to do like that. He leaves the decision to Arjuna. So similarly, the Srimad Bhagavatam is a conversation between Sukadeva Goswami and Maharaj Parikshit, where Maharaj Parikshit asks different questions about life, about philosophy, and Sukadeva Goswami answers. And this principle of gaining knowledge and imparting knowledge is also described beautifully in chapter 4, Gyan Yoga of Bhagavad Gita, verse 34. Tadvidhi pranipatena pariprashnena sevaya upadekshanti jnanam jnanina tattadarshina. So that means if you If you approach a bona fide spiritual master with humility, with service attitude, with proper frame of mind, with inquisitiveness, then that person will be able to impart you the knowledge because that person has seen the truth. Okay. Next, the pragmatism of verifiability, the third aspect in spirituality. So I say that the spirituality is verifiable and the proof is in the pudding. So for example, in chemistry lab, when you want to test if something is acid or base, you do litmus test, right? The change of color tells you the result. So similarly, the effect of all spiritual practices are also verifiable. So you cannot just avoid the practice and say this does not help anything. In order to be able to accept or deny the theory behind the practices or the results of the practices, you yourself have to do it, okay? And you have to do it in the proper way. So for example, in science, okay, if you want to do a complicated experiment in physics or in chemistry, you have to follow the procedure, right? You have to take the right temperature, you have to, if a vacuum is needed, you have to create it perfectly, okay? So there, if in material science, you have to follow a step-by-step process critically, adhering to the specification minutely, then what to speak of spirituality that deals with much more difficult aspect of your mind and, intellect and soul. So there also you have to follow the practices that are written in bona fide scripture, that is prescribed by bona fide spiritual teachers, perfectly as it is, as they're prescribed, following proper duration of time. And then if you do not see any result, then you have the right to deny it, okay? And if you see the result, then you have the right to accept it. Okay, so 2 minutes, I'll just finish it quickly. So in science, there are two approaches. It has been discussed here also, deductive and inductive. So deductive is axiom, then inference, then some theorem and proofs. In inductive, we have axiom, hypothesis, experiment and conclusion. So for example, mathematics is a deductive science. You start with some axiom, like in geometry, you start with 5 axioms of geometry, and then you prove some theorem, and the result is established. Whereas there are other fields of science, for example, biology, okay, chemistry, natural sciences, or physics. So there, you start with some axiom, you guess something, you have some hypothesis, then you do the experimentation, and based on your observation, if it is repeatable, if you get the same result, then you conclude the theory. So the problem of deductive science is it is incomplete and inconsistent. I am not discussing in detail, but it has been discussed by other speakers. So these are basically Gödel statements. So for example, here this statement is false. If you accept it is true, then this statement is false. If you accept this statement is false, then it is true. So you cannot prove the truth or falseness of any arbitrary sentence. What to speak of proving existence of God? Okay. So the parallels between inductive and inductive approach in science and spirituality is that you have axioms. For example, existence of soul and God can be treated as axiom. Then you have hypothesis. So if you have a connection between the soul and God, then you will achieve happiness. So that can be treated as a hypothesis. Then the process of yoga or meditation can be treated as experiment to actually verify the hypothesis. And after you have performed the experiment and you have done the observation, then you can conclude. Okay. So in the end, I have just 2-3 slides to raise a few relevant questions on this, and I will just give one-line answer to each. So some people ask that religion is the root of all riots and fights in the world, so should not religion be banned for global peace? Now I see that even science is also suffers the same cause. So for example, physics causes atom bombs, and these are the results. Okay, even now in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there are babies they are born due to the effect of these bombs. So should physics be banned in all the universities? Right. So it depends on the use. Then why follow a spiritual path? Can't everyone invent one's own path through one's life's lessons? Many people ask the question on spirituality, but you can ask the same question on science, right? So in science, does everyone reinvent the wheel or electricity? So do you say that, okay, I don't want electric connection in my room, first let me verify the theory of electricity? No, you don't. You try to take advantage of something which has already been verified and established. So same thing you can do in spiritual science if you want to save time. If you don't want to save time, you have many lifetimes in your hand, you are sure, then you go ahead. Next, why follow a spiritual master or guru? Can't one follow a spiritual path on one's own? So let's look at science. Then why do you need a lab instructor or a PhD supervisor? You can do research on your own, right? So that's the thing. Next, doesn't spirituality promote superstition and weakness like stone, fortune teller, caste system, untouchability? Well, in science, don't you have problems with scientific advancement also? So in earlier days when you had, say the postal system, we had less trouble. Now we have email, mobiles and etc. and we have bigger problems, right? So if you, so because of the MMS problem, do you like reject mobile? Do you don't use mobile? Okay. So your credit card, right? The cash-based transaction was much safer, and now due to credit card, there are a lot of fraud transactions and a lot of issues. So do you avoid this online banking and cashless transaction? No. So what we try to do in science, we try to make protection mechanism. We try to build software or say other systems that will detect such vulnerabilities and remove such vulnerabilities. So my question is then, in spirituality also there are some people who do it not for the sake of spirituality but for their own benefit. So they inject all these superstition and other issues. So why not build a protective system? Why not build the knowledge, share the knowledge and make yourself stronger so that you can identify what is the true spirituality and what is fake spirituality. Okay. So the last question. Yeah, this is the last slide. So science gives tangible result, people say. So for example, AC in the summer, and I say, what about the summer of the mind? Okay, so there you need spirituality. I have already mentioned about it. And so after you turn on the AC of the mind through the practice of spirituality, then you can smile. So thank you for your attention. I will end my talk here. And this is just an example of a synthesis of science and spirituality. Okay, welcome. Thank you.
And may I now request the chair, Mr. Prabhakar Ballapalli, to come here and present the mementos to these wonderful speakers. First, I request Dr. Narasimha. Kaushik. Dr. Gautam Paul. Now I will request Mr. Samir to come here and present a memento to our kind chair. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I think it's a time for refreshment.